Hello, welcome. Today I wanted to make a short video explaining why it is not historic to think that it is not historically accurate to think that Jesus Christ resurrecting was a myth. And that theory is growing amongst skeptics and atheists, among college professors who aren't believers. And the thing is when you actually get down to the bare bones and you actually do the historical research, you'll see that this theory has really bad evidence. You need another theory. The actual theory that makes more evidence is the conspiracy theory, not the myth theory. The myth theory is actually a horrible theory. The theory that, okay, the apostles did not witness Jesus Christ appearing to them, but decades later, years later, Jesus was a good man, and 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years later, it just ended up morphing into the belief that Jesus was the Son of God and resurrecting. No. And here's why. Here's why that's very unhistorical, and I'm making this video for Christians. I'm not making this for militant atheists who want to argue. I'm tired of arguing with militant atheists because it's wasting a lot of my time. If you're an open-minded person, whether you're an atheist or a Christian, I would love to have a discussion with you. But I'm really tired of debating because it's preventing me from making videos and sharing the good news. And I really want to be reaffirming to other Christians. This is why the myth theory doesn't work, is that there's not enough time for a myth to develop. Now, the Romans conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD. Where in the book of Acts or where in the Bible does it say that the Romans conquered Jerusalem? You can't find it. That's right. Now, if Acts was written after 70 AD, it would be all over there. The temple fell in 70 AD, or 72 AD. I get it confused, but one of those two dates. It would be all over there. Now, Jesus Christ predicted and marked that the temple would fall. Now, the temple actually did fall before the Gospels were written and before Acts was written, and knowing that he predicted it, the writers would continually remind us that, hey, Jesus predicted this and it happened. Jesus, like in the book of Matthew, you can't open the book of Matthew without Matthew reminding us of all the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. I mean, he says, hey, he fulfilled this prophecy, he fulfilled this prophecy, he fulfilled this. It's all over the book of Matthew. Well, it would be the same way. The Jews were ultra-nationalists. And Jesus Christ's prediction about the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple coming true, they would not let the readers miss that. Most likely, Paul died and Peter died in Nero's persecution in 66 AD. Acts does not record that. And that's why, Acts follows Peter and Paul. And please listen, this is a key point. Since Acts does not have Peter and Paul's death, and does not have the fall of the temple, does not have the fall of Jerusalem in it, it is safe to say that not only was it written before 70 AD, but it was written before 66 AD. Don't listen to people who try to push it back. It wasn't back. And there's a lot of internal evidence that suggests this too, like Zacchaeus on the sycamore tree, and there's just so much stuff. But this is just the big stuff. So there's no way that Acts could have been written after 70 AD. Trust me. They would have, but you're not going to trust me, but use common sense. Luke would have continued to remind us about the fall of the temple. That was such a huge deal. And especially since Jesus predicted it. Now, what came before Acts? Well, Luke did. So if Acts was written before 66 AD, well then when was the book of Luke written? Well, Luke had to be written between 60 and 66 AD. So, let's just say 62 to 63. So then we had the book of Mark. When was the book of Mark written? Now you're going to have some very liberal, skeptical professors who don't believe in Jesus, or kind of lukewarm about Jesus, and they kind of don't want to be lumped in with the fundamentalists, and they're just going to say, in the 70s or 80s, but using common sense, like I just provided common sense that people will agree on if you follow the logic. If Acts has to be written before 66 AD and Luke has to be written before Acts, as I just showed, if Mark used Luke as a source, which he did, Luke used Mark as a source. So Mark was written first. So we'll say Mark was written in about 56 AD. If Jesus died and rose again in 30 to 33 AD, that's like 23 years. That's not enough time for our myth to develop. Okay? There's not enough time. Myths don't develop that time. Jesus Christ died in Jerusalem and then rose from the dead in Jerusalem. The same people were there. The same people that saw Jesus died and witnessed his death. And you're going to say that the same people that are living in that proximity are living there, and they wouldn't shut down a myth as soon as it came? I mean, yeah, if a myth came like 200 years later and the people that were living there all died out, and a generation later, yeah, maybe it's possible if it's like generations later, but this is 20 years later. You get the same people living there for the most part. There's not enough time for a myth to develop, and if you don't get this, please leave a comment and I'll explain it in a further video, and I'll make more sense. Second of all, if you're trying to create a myth, you will not use women as sources. I don't know if I mentioned that or not already, but women can't, in the ancient Jewish, in the ancient Roman, in the ancient Greek worlds, women couldn't even testify in courts. So if the early Christians were intentionally trying to make a myth that Jesus Christ was the God, was the Lord and Savior, they would not have made women being the first witnesses. And some atheists will say, well, women were the ones that would have gone to the tomb on the first, in the early morning to take care of the dead body. They were the ones expected, so it makes sense that they were the first witnesses. No, that doesn't make sense. And this is why this doesn't make sense. It is because if Christianity was a made-up faith, they would have rearranged the whole story so that Peter was the one that saw Jesus Christ first. Or John. Those were the two premier apostles, not the women. What happened? What happened when the women came and they told the news to the apostles? Peter ran to the tomb. He didn't believe them. That was the common thought in the ancient world. So the Gospels saying that women were the first witnesses, that was an embarrassing thing for them to say. That was an embarrassing thing for the Gospel authors to say in the first century. They wouldn't have said that unless it was the truth. They wouldn't have said that unless it was the truth. And third, you have the Apostle Paul. That's the atheist's worst nightmare. Just Paul alone disproves atheism. But I'm not trying to be against. I'm not trying to pick I'm trying to reinforce Christianity here. Paul himself, and let me say that again, Paul himself destroys the myth theory. If you want to debate when the Gospels were written, I think you're wrong. My theory holds up. But 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, those were written early. Even Romans was written in the early 60s. But the Pauline letters, even the ones that atheists say that he wrote, I mean, you can't deny that Paul existed and that Paul wrote most of the letters attributed to him. Now, as Christians, we say that he wrote all the letters attributed to him, but atheist scholars, historians, will say that he at least wrote most of the letters attributed to him. They were written early, and Paul certainly believed that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. Not enough time for a myth to develop. And go to 1 Corinthians 15. He talks about the witnesses of the 12. He talks about James. He talks about himself. Now, I know he talks about the 500, and I know that's not convincing because he doesn't name off the 500. But he says, hey, and the thing that's interesting about 1 Corinthians 15 is that, and even Bart Ehrman, I think at one time, now Bart Ehrman he's agnostic. He changes his mind a lot. I'm not even going to go with, he changes his mind a lot, so I'm not even going to use him. But most New Testament scholars now think that 1 Corinthians 15 was a creed, an oral creed helping Christians memorize the faith that originated 6 months to 6 years after the resurrection of Christ. 6 months to 6 years, and you're asking for early sources. Do you see how amazing this is? Now, this is the fourth reason why the gospel, and I'm doing this off the top of my head. I don't have notes. I should have notes. I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't know how to do that. Maybe someone can help me do that. I don't know how to do that. This is the fourth reason, is that the gospels aren't written in mythical language. Ancient myths always, and it's like Jesus' parables that were, they were myths, but they had a point. He said nothing He said nothing for granted. Everything he said came around in a circle and meant something. Now in the Gospels, there's a lot of things that just happen, and you're wondering, well, does this lead back to something? And they don't. They don't lead back to anywhere. For instance, in John, Jesus writing on the sand. Okay, and the adulterous woman is caught. Jesus is writing on the sand. The Pharisees say, hey, what do you say we should do with the woman? Jesus looks and he says, well, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. And then what does he do? He goes back and he writes more on the sand. Now what he was writing on the sand, it could have had a lot of meaning. It could have had a ton of meaning. But we don't know what it is. To the readers, it means nothing. To us, we can only speculate. He could have been writing the Ten Commandments. He could have been writing the sins of the sins of those who were prosecuting the woman. He could have been writing about grace. We don't know. And that's the thing, is that if the Gospels were a myth, it would have left that out. That's a detail that just wastes space. And in those days, paper was super expensive. And the teaching that Jesus said, there's just so many examples. If you just read through, even a movie today, they don't have incidental things they wouldn't have someone, like Jesus writing on the sand was a big part of that parable. He was writing on the sand, then after he was asked a question, the Bible says he goes back. Him writing on the sand was a big part of that parable, but it doesn't tell us what he was writing. It's like useless information for us. A myth wouldn't have that in it. Lastly, the New Testament, the Gospels name 40 historical characters. 40 historical characters that we can verify. Myths don't do that. Myths don't have verification of 40 historical characters. Now, the first biography of Alexander the Great was written over 100 years after his death. And if you want to go with the Tiberius, the Roman emperor during the time of Jesus Christ, there's actually more sources for Jesus by a lot than compared to Tiberius. So let's not even... Jesus is well sourced within the first 150 years of his life. Let's compare with him the same ancient world standards. I hope I was understood during this video. I know I speak slow, and I apologize for that. I hope I was understood. And God bless you, and I'm not trying to debate. I'm not trying to call anyone stupid or anything like that. Thank you. Bye.